Chapter 26 or Book 2 Part 13. Creta Kano's story continued. Creta Kano was stark naked. Facing toward my side of the bed, she lay there asleep with nothing on, not even a cover, revealing two well-shaped breasts, two small pink nipples, and below a perfectly flat stomach, a black triangle of pubic hair, looking like a shaded area in a drawing. Her skin was very white, with a newly minted glow. At a loss to explain her presence here, I nevertheless went on staring at her beautiful body. She had her knees closed tightly together and slightly bent, her legs in perfect alignment. Her hair fell forward, covering half her face, which made it impossible for me to see her eyes. But she was obviously in a deep sleep. My turning on the bedside lamp had caused not the slightest tremble, and her breathing was quiet and regular. I myself, though, was now wide awake. I took a thin summer comforter from the closet and spread it over her. Then I turned out the lamp and, still in my pajamas, went to the kitchen to sit at the table for a while. I recalled my mark. That patch on my cheek was still slightly warm to touch. It was still there, all right. I had no need to look in the mirror. It wasn't the kind of little nothing that just disappears by itself overnight. I thought about looking up a nearby dermatologist in the phone book when it got light out. But how could I answer if a doctor asked me what I thought the cause might be? I was in a well for 2 or 3 days. No, it had nothing to do with work or anything. I was just there to do a little thinking. I figured the bottom of a well would be a good place for that. No, I didn't take any food with me. No, it wasn't on my property. It belonged to another house, a vacant house in the neighborhood. I went in without permission. I sighed. I could never say these things to anyone, of course. I set my elbows on the table and, without really intending to, found myself thinking in strangely vivid detail about Creta Kano's naked body. She was sound asleep in my bed. I thought about the time in my dream when I joined my body with hers as she wore Kumiko's dress. I still had a clear impression of the touch of her skin, the weight of her flesh. Without a step-by-step investigation of that event, I would not be able to distinguish the point at which the real ended and the unreal took over. The wall separating the two regions had begun to melt. In my memory, at least, the real and the unreal seemed to be residing together with equal weight and vividness. I had joined my body with Creta Kano's, and at the same time, I had not. To clear my head of these jumbled sexual images, I had to go to the wash basin and splash my face with cold water. A little while later, I looked in on Creta Kano. She was still sound asleep. She had pushed the cover down to her waist. From where I stood, I could see only her back. It reminded me of my last view of Kumiko's back. Not that I thought about it, Creta Kano's figure was amazingly like Kumiko's. I had failed to notice the resemblance until now, because their hair and their taste in clothes and their makeup were so utterly different. They were the same height and appeared to be about the same weight. They probably wore the same dress size. I carried my own summer comforter to the living room, stretched out on the sofa, and opened my book. I had been reading a history book from the library. It was all about Japanese management of Manchuria before the war and the battle with the Soviets in Numonhan. Lieutenant Mamiya's story had aroused my interest in continental affairs of the period, and I had borrowed several books on the subject. Now, however, less than 10 minutes into the finely detailed historical narrative, I was falling asleep. I laid the book on the floor, intending to rest my eyes for a few moments, but I fell into a deep sleep, with the lights still on. A sound from the kitchen woke me up. When I went to investigate, Creta Kano was there, making breakfast, wearing a white t-shirt and blue shirts, both of which belonged to Kumiko. "Where are your clothes?" I demanded, standing in the kitchen door. "Oh, I'm sorry. You were asleep, so I took the liberty of borrowing some of your wife's clothing. I knew it was terribly forward of me, but I didn't have a thing to wear," said Creta Kano, turning just her head to look at me. At some point since I last saw her, she had reverted to her usual 60s style of hair and makeup, lacking only the fake eyelashes. "No, that's no problem," I said. "What I want to know is what happened to your clothes." "I lost them," she said simply. "Lost them?" "Yes, I lost them somewhere." I stepped into the kitchen and watched, leaning against the table, as Creta Kano made an omelette. With deft movements, she cracked the eggs, added seasoning, and beat the mixture. Meaning you came here naked? Yes, that is correct, said Creta, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I was completely naked. You know that, Mr. Okada. You put the cover on me. Well, true enough, I mumbled. But what I'd like to know is where and how did you lose your clothing, and how did you manage to get here with nothing on? I don't know that any better than you do, said Katakano, while shaking the frying pan to fold the omelette over on itself. You don't know that any better than I do, I said. Katakano slipped the omelette onto the plate and garnished it with a few stalks of freshly steamed broccoli. She had also made toast, which she set on the table along with coffee. I put out the butter and salt and pepper. Then, like a newly married couple, we sat down to breakfast, facing each other. It was then that I recalled my mark. Katakano had shown no surprise when she looked at me, and she asked me nothing about it. I reached up to touch the spot and found it slightly warm, as before. Does that hurt, Mr. Okada? No, not at all, I said. Katakano stared at my face for a time. It looks like a mark, she said. It looks like a mark to me too, I said. I'm wondering whether I should show it to a doctor or not. It strikes me as something that a doctor would not be able to handle. You may be right, I said, but I can't just ignore it. Fork in hand, Katakano thought for a moment. If you have shopping or other business, I could do it for you. You can stay inside as long as you like, if you'd rather not go out. I'm grateful for the offer, but you must have your own things to do, and I can't just stay holed up in here forever. Katakano thought about that for a while too. Maltakano would probably know how to deal with this. Would you mind getting in touch with her for me, then? Maltakano gets in touch with other people, but she does not allow other people to get in touch with her. Katakano bit into a piece of broccoli. But you can get in touch with her, I'm sure. Of course, we're sisters. Well, next time you talk to her, why don't you ask her about my mark? Or you could ask her to get in touch with me. I am sorry, but that is something I cannot do. I am not allowed to approach my sister on someone else's behalf. It's a sort of rule we have. Buttering my toast, I let out a sigh. You mean to say, if I have something I need to talk to Maltakano about, all I can do is wait for her to get in touch with me? That is exactly what I mean, said Katakano. Then she nodded. But about that mark, unless it hurts or itches, I suggest that you forget about it for a while. I never let things like that bother me, and you should not let it bother you either, Mr. Okada. People just get these things sometimes. I wonder, I said. For several minutes after that, we went on eating our breakfast in silence. I hadn't eaten breakfast with another person for quite a while now, and this one was particularly delicious. Katakano seemed pleased when I told her this. Anyhow, I said, about your clothes. Does it bother you that I put on your wife's clothing without permission? She asked, with obvious concern. No, not at all. I don't care what you wear of Kumiko's. She left them here after all. What I'm concerned about is how you lost your own clothes. And not just my clothes, my shoes too. So how did it happen? I can't remember, said Katakano. All I know is I woke up in your bed with nothing on. I can't remember what happened before that. You did go down into the well, didn't you, after I left? That I do remember. And I fell asleep down there. But I can't remember anything after that. Which means you don't have any recollection of how you got out of the well? None at all. There is a gap in my memory. Katakano held up both index fingers, about 8 inches apart. How much time that was supposed to represent, I had no idea. I don't suppose you remember what you did with the rope ladder either? It's gone, you know. I don't know anything about the ladder. I don't even remember if I climbed it to get out of the well. I glared at the coffee cup in my hand for a time. Do you mind showing me the bottoms of your feet? I asked. No, not at all, said Katakano. She sat down in the chair next to mine and stretched her legs out in my direction so that I could see the soles of her feet. I took her ankles in my hands and examined her soles. They were perfectly clean, beautifully formed. The soles had not a mark on them, no cuts, no mud, nothing at all. No mud, no cuts, I said. I see, said Katakano. It was raining all day yesterday. If you lost your shoes somewhere and walked here from there, you should have some mud on your feet. And you must have come in through the garden. But your feet are clean. And there's no mud anywhere. I see. Which means you didn't walk here barefoot from anywhere. Creta Kano inclined her head slightly to one side as if impressed. This is all logically consistent, she said. It may be logically consistent, but it's not getting us anywhere, I said. Where did you lose your shoes and clothes? And how did you walk here from there? Creta Kano shook her head. I have no idea, she said. While she stood at the sink, intently washing the dishes, I stared at the kitchen table, thinking about these things. Of course, I had no idea either. Do these things happen to you often, that you can't remember where you've been? I asked. This is not the first time that something like this has happened to me, when I can't recall where I've been or what I was doing. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen to me now and then. I once lost some clothes too, but this is the first time I lost all my clothes and my shoes and everything. Creta Kano turned off the water and wiped the table with a dish towel. You know, Creta Kano, I said, you haven't told me your whole story. Last time you were partway through when you disappeared. Remember? If you don't mind, I'd like to hear the rest. You told me how the mob got hold of you and made you work as one of their prostitutes, but you didn't tell me what happened after you met Noboru Wataya and slept with him. Creta Kano leaned against the kitchen sink and looked at me. Drops of water on her hands ran down her fingers and fell to the floor. The shape of her nipples showed clearly through the white t-shirt, a vivid reminder to me of the naked body I had seen the night before. All right then, I will tell you everything that happened after that, right now. Creta Kano sat down once again in the seat opposite mine. The reason I left that day when I was in the middle of my story, Mr. Okada, is that I was not fully prepared to tell it all. I had started my story precisely because I felt I ought to tell you, as honestly as possible, what really happened to me. But I found I could not go all the way to the end. You must have been shocked when I disappeared so suddenly. Well, Creta Kano put her hands on the table and looked straight at me as she spoke. Well, yes, I was shocked, though it was not the most shocking thing that's happened to me lately. As I told you before, the very last customer I had as a prostitute of the flesh was Noboru Wataya. The second time I met him as a client of Malta Kano's, I recognized him immediately. It would have been impossible for me to forget him. Whether he remembered me or not, I cannot be certain. Mr. Wataya is not a person who shows his feelings. But let me go back and put things in order. First, I will tell you about the time I had Noboru Wataya as a customer. That would be 6 years ago. As I told you before, I was in a state at the time in which I had absolutely no perception of pain. And not only pain, I had no sensations of any kind. I lived in a bottomless numbness. Of course, I don't mean to say that I was unable to feel any sensation at all. I knew when something was hot or cold or painful, but these sensations came to me as if from a distance, from a world that had nothing to do with me, which is why I felt no resistance to the idea of having sexual relations with men for money. No matter what anyone did to me, the sensations I felt did not belong to me. My unfeeling flesh was not my flesh. Now, let's see. I told you about how I had been recruited by the mob's prostitution ring. When they told me to sleep with men, I did it. And when they paid me, I took it. I left off at that point. I nodded to her. That day, they told me to go to a room on the 16th floor of a downtown hotel. The client had the unusual name of Wataya. I knocked on the door and went in to find the man sitting on the sofa. He had apparently been drinking room service coffee while reading a book. He wore a green polo shirt and brown cotton pants. His hair was short and he wore brown framed glasses. On the coffee table in front of him were his cup and coffee pot and the book. He seemed to have been deeply absorbed in his reading. There was a kind of excitement still in his eyes. His features were in no way remarkable, but those eyes of his had an energy about them that was almost weird. When I first saw them, I thought for a moment that I was in the wrong room. But it was not the wrong room. The man told me to come inside and lock the door. Still seated on the sofa, without saying a word, he ran his eyes over my body, from head to foot. That was what usually happened when I entered a client's room. Most men would look me over. Excuse me for asking, Mr. Okada, but have you ever bought a prostitute? I said that I had not. It's as if they were looking over merchandise. It doesn't take long to get used to being looked at like that. They are paying money for flesh after all. It makes sense for them to examine the goods. But the way that man looked at me was different. He seemed to be looking through my flesh to something on the other side. His eye made me feel uneasy, as if I had become half-transparent human being. I was a little confused, I suppose. I dropped my hand back on the floor. It made a small sound, but I was in such an abstracted state that, for a time, I was almost unaware of what I had done. Then I stooped down to pick up the bag. The clasp had opened when it hit the floor, and some of my cosmetics had fallen out. I picked up my eyebrow pencil and lip cream and a small bottle of eau de cologne, returning each of them to my bag. He kept those eyes of his trained on me the whole time. When I finished gathering up my things from the floor and putting them back in the bag, he told me to undress. I asked him if it would be alright for me to take a shower first, because I had been perspiring quite a bit. The weather was hot that day, and I had been sweating on the subway. He didn't care about that, he said. He didn't have much time. He wanted me to undress right away. Once I was naked, he told me to lie on the bed face down, which I did. He ordered me to stay still, to keep my eyes closed, and not to speak until I was spoken to. He sat down next to me with his clothes on. That was all he did, sit down. He did not lay a finger on me. He just sat and looked down at my naked body. He kept this up for some 10 minutes while I lay there, unmoving, face down. I could feel his eyes boring into the nape of my neck, my back, my buttocks, and my legs with almost painful intensity. It occurred to me that he might be important. Customers like that turn up now and then. They buy a prostitute, have her undress, and they look at her. Some will undress the woman and finish themselves off in her presence. All kinds of men buy prostitutes for all kinds of reasons. I just assumed he was one of those. After a while, though, he reached out and began to touch me. His fingers moved down my body, from my shoulders to my back, from my back to my buttocks, in search of something. This was not foreplay. Neither, of course, was it a massage. His fingers moved over my body with the utmost care, as if tracing a route on a map. And all the while he touched my flesh, he seemed to be thinking. Not in any ordinary sense of the word, but seriously thinking about something with the utmost concentration. 1 minute his fingers would seem to be wandering here and there at random, and the next they would come to a stop and remain for a long time in the one place. It felt as if the fingers themselves were going from confusion to certainty. Am I making myself clear? Each finger seemed to be alive and thinking, with a will of its own. It was a very strange sensation, strange and disturbing. And yet the touch of his fingers aroused me sexually. For the first time in my life, sex had been nothing but a source of pain for me until I became a prostitute. The mere thought of it had filled me with fear of the pain I knew I would have to endure. Just the opposite happened after I became a prostitute. I felt nothing. I no longer felt pain, but I felt no other sensation either. I would sigh and pretend to be aroused for the pleasure of the customer, but it was all fake, a professional act. When he touched me, though, my sighs were real. They came out of my body's innermost depths. I knew that something inside me had begun to move, as if my center of gravity were changing locations in my body, first to one place and then to another. Eventually the man stopped moving his fingers. With his hands on my waist, he seemed to be thinking. Through his fingertips, I could tell that he was steadying himself, quietly regularizing his breathing. Then he began to remove his clothing. I kept my eyes closed and my face buried in the pillow, waiting for what would come next. Once he was naked, he spread my arms and legs open wide. The room was almost frighteningly quiet. The only sound was the soft rush of the air conditioner. The man himself made almost no perceptible sounds. I couldn't even hear him breathing. He placed his palms on my back. I went limp. His penis touched my buttocks, but it was still soft. Just then, the phone on the night table began to ring. I opened my eyes and turned my head to look at the man's face, but he seemed unaware that the phone was ringing. It rang 8 or 9 times and then stopped. Again the room became silent. Kano paused at that point for a few measured breaths. She remained silent, looking at her own hands. "I am sorry," she said, "but do you mind if I take a short break?" "Not at all," I said. I refilled my coffee cup and took a sip. She drank her cold water. We sat there without speaking for a good 10 minutes. His fingers began to move again, touching every part of my body, Creta Kano continued. Every part without exception. I lost the power to think. My ears were filled with the sound of my own heart, pounding but with strange slowness. I could no longer control myself. I cried out aloud again and again as he caressed me. I tried to keep my voice in check, but another someone was using my voice to moan and shout. I felt as if every screw in my body had come loose. Then, after a very long time, and with me still lying face down, he put something inside me from behind. What it was, I still have no idea. It was huge and hard, but it was not his penis. I am certain of that. I remember thinking that I had been right. He was important after all. Whatever it was that he put inside me, it made me feel pain for the first time since my failed suicide attempt. Real, intense pain that belonged to me and to no one else. How can I put this? The pain was almost impossibly intense, as if my physical self were splitting in two from the inside out. And yet, as terrible as it felt, I was writhing as much in pleasure as in pain. The pleasure and pain were one. Do you see what I mean? The pain was founded on pleasure, and the pleasure on pain. I had to swallow the two as a single entity. In the midst of this pain and pleasure, my flesh went on splitting in two. There was no way for me to prevent it from happening. Then something very weird occurred. Out from between the two cleanly split halves of my physical self came crawling a thing that I had never seen or touched before. How large it was I could not tell, but it was as wet and slippery as a newborn baby. I had absolutely no idea what it was. It had always been inside me, and yet it was something of which I had no knowledge. This man had drawn it out of me. I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. It was a part of me, after all. I had a right to see it, but this was impossible. I was caught in the torrent of pleasure and pain. An entirely physical being, I could only cry out and drool and churn my hips. The mere act of opening my eyes was an impossibility. I then reached the sexual peak, although rather than a peak, it felt more as if I were being thrown down from a high cliff. I screamed, and I felt as if every piece of glass in the room had shattered. I not only felt it, I actually saw and heard the windows and drinking glasses shattering into powder fragments and felt them raining down on me. I then felt horribly sick to my stomach. My consciousness began to slip away and my body turned cold. I know this will sound strange, but I felt as if I had turned into a bowl of cold porridge, all sticky and lumpy, and the lumps were throbbing slowly and hugely with each bit of my heart. I recognized this throbbing. It had happened to me before, nor did it take very long for me to recall what it was. I knew it as that dull, fatal, never-ending pain that I had experienced before my failed suicide attempt. And like a crowbar, the pain was prying open the lid of my consciousness, prying it open with an irresistible force and dragging out the gelid contents of my memory without reference to my will. Strange as it may sound, this was like a dead person watching her own autopsy. Do you see what I mean? I felt as if I were watching from some vantage point as my body was being cut open and one slimy organ after another was being pulled out of me. I continued to lie there, drooling on the pillow, my body racked with convulsions and incontinent. I knew that I should try to control myself, but I had lost the power for such control. Every screw in my body had not only come loose, but had fallen out. In my clouded brain, I felt with incredible intensity exactly how alone and how powerless I was. Everything came gushing out of me. Things both tangible and intangible turned into liquid and flowed out through my flesh like saliva or urine. I knew that I should not let this happen, that I should not allow my very self to spill out this way and be lost forever. But there was nothing I could do to stanch the flow. I could only watch it happen. How long this continued, I have no idea. It seemed as if all my memories, all my consciousness had just slipped away. Everything that had been inside me was outside now. Eventually, like a heavy curtain falling, darkness enveloped me in an instant. And when I regained consciousness, I was a different person. Creta Kano stopped speaking at that point and looked at me. That is what happened then, she said softly. I said nothing but waited instead for the rest of her story.